I wonder if we can start with the book, perhaps. Men Who Hate Women. It is a title that I'm sure will put a few noses out of joint and provoke a few hashtag not all men responses. But tell us just a little bit about what its central argument is.
Well, the clue's in the title. It's men who hate women, not men hate women. We know that the vast majority of men out there would never dream and believe in behaving in these ways. But nonetheless, it is important to recognise that there is a real undercurrent of extremist misogyny in this country and around the world. And what the book uncovers is that there are communities of men actively advocating that women should be raped, should be brutally murdered, should be kept as sex slaves, and that these men are in communities hundreds of thousands strong. They're not just a few weirdos on the internet, as people might like to think. What's really worrying is that the research for the book uncovered the fact that they're very deliberately radicalizing and grooming young men in ways that we simply don't necessarily recognize. So many teenage boys are being very deliberately reached out to by these communities and given these real misconceptions about feminism and about women, and that they're leaking out further into our society as well. 27% of American men now say that they wouldn't have a meeting one-to-one in the workplace on their own with a woman. So some of these ideas that we might think of as very niche and extreme online issues are actually becoming quite worryingly widespread.
Just in terms, though, of these misogynist networks, hundreds of thousands of people being indoctrinated, in essence, but who are responsible for them? Who are behind them? I mean, you mentioned that it's not just about some weirdos in the internet, because your thoughts immediately go to the incel movement, but it's a lot bigger than that, clearly.
It is. It does include the incel movement, so-called involuntary celibate men who believe that they're not having sex and blame women for not giving it to them. But it also goes much further than that. It includes groups like men's rights activists, so-called pickup artists. That's a $100 million global industry, essentially training men to sexually harass and in some cases sexually assault women. Some of these are industry so-called leaders who can rake in thousands of pounds from their supporters, from running boot camps. So there is money there. And there's also political benefit to be had from courting these groups. One Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, for example, said that Steve Bannon had deliberately courted the incel vote for Donald Trump. So these are much bigger and perhaps much more powerful groups than we might have acknowledged previously.
So how best then for us to intervene in these networks, in these spaces, and in fact, who best to intervene in these networks? Because it strikes me that in these communities, a woman's voice is probably not desperately welcomed.
Yes, I think we do need to see men stepping up and offering young people in particular alternative places to get that sense of community and of purpose and of role modeling masculinity that these communities are so seductively providing. We also need to support vulnerable teenage boys who are very seduced by these communities, in part because of massive funding cuts to offline places where they could have got those kinds of inputs. So, for example, youth centres, adolescent mental health funding. We need to protect and support young men so that they don't fall prey to what really is a radicalising and grooming network, although we never label it in that way. In just the same way that we don't label the many men who have come offline and carried out massacres of women in the name of exactly some of these movements, terrorists. We don't use the word terrorism to describe them. We don't call what they're doing online radicalization. And yet I think we can see in our society all around us the impact of this extremist misogyny being very deliberately spread. This week, perhaps, as much as ever.
Laura, given the scale of the problem, which some people seem to become aware of only in the past kind of couple of weeks, that practically every woman has experienced some form of abuse, perhaps even sexual assault, or, and given the fact that, that a lot of men have been, ultimately responsible for it, I mean, how confident are you that there is actually a way out of this?
I think that there is a way forward, but what it needs is real systemic structural change and not just platitudes. A lot of people have said this week, wow, this is a tipping point. This is a moment of reckoning, as if women have never before risen up in a cry of grief and rage and shared their millions of stories. This carries on happening, and it will continue to happen unless we start to take notice of all of these cases, not just the odd one that hits the headline. This book would have been relevant a couple of months ago when an older woman was killed by her husband, who strangled her to death and was given just 5 years in prison. It would have been relevant less than a year ago when police officers were taking selfies of themselves next to the murdered bodies of 2 Black women. It would have been relevant on any one of the 2 women a week who are killed on average in the UK every week. So, You know, this is an ongoing problem, but if we want to see that change happen, it is possible. But what it takes is political and structural will. So it takes education, looking at what we're teaching boys at school instead of telling girls not to wear short skirts. And it needs somebody to have the will to take on the institutional reform that's needed of a justice system that is systematically, institutionally racist and misogynistic. Just 1.5% of rape cases reported to the police in this country result in a charge or summons. So that's where we need to be looking for structural change, not telling women to stay in at night or to wear something different.
Well, Laura, let's see if any or most of that takes place at some point soon. I certainly hope so. Laura Bates, good to have you on the programme this morning. Thank you so much for joining us.